Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us in this session, which is all about building public trust and confidence in digital identity systems. My name is Louise Maynard-Atem, and I am the research lead for the nonprofit Women in Identity. Well, part of my time does that, and the other part of my time is I'm the head of data insights for GBG, an identity and fraud organization. So today we're going to be talking about digital identity and how we build confidence and trust in those systems. I don't think I need to reiterate the point that over the past 2 years, the experiences that we've all had have really sort of sped up the requirement for a digital identity. I think, the use cases were always there, but COVID-19 kind of put all of that into hyper speed. So today I really want to talk about, with this brilliant panel, how we build that public confidence and that public trust. I think we within the industry are understanding of how important digital identity is, but for it to really have the benefit that it could have, we need to ensure that the public really believes and trusts in these systems to do what we need them to do. So I think we've got a range of brilliant panelists from all different elements of the sort of digital identity ecosystem that will all come with slightly different and hopefully complementary views on how we make this work. And instead of me doing botched introductions for each of them, I will let them introduce themselves. I've got a few sort of like pre-canned questions here to ask of them, but I would absolutely encourage everybody in the audience to share your questions in the chat function, and I will raise as many of those as I possibly can. You probably don't want to just hear my questions all the way through this next 50 minutes. So please, I encourage you all to ask as many questions as you can, and I will try and get through as many of them as possible. But first up, I will introduce the brilliant panel, or rather I'll let them introduce themselves, and then I'll kick off with an opening question. So if I come to Kendrick, can you introduce yourself, please?
Right, thank you, Louise. Good morning, afternoon, evening, everyone. So I'm Kendrick from the Government Technology Agency in Singapore. It's a statutory board under the Prime Minister's office. I look after product management and go-to-market of our National Digital Identity. We call it NDI for short. And NDI is one of the 8 strategic national projects that drive Singapore's Smart Nation vision. Today, I'm excited to share our experiences implementing SingPass, our National Digital Identity Program, and how we're building public trust and confidence, right, which we think is very important in driving pervasive adoption and usage. Thank you.
Thank you, Kendrick, and I appreciate it's a little bit late but where you are, so thank you for joining us in your evening. Next, I will come to Seymour.
Hi, everyone. Louise, good to see you again. I'm Seymour Kinder-Johnson. I'm co-founder and COO of Nuggets. I've been in tech for over 20 years, and really, for me, what started this process was that my husband had his credit card used fraudulently online, and that incredibly frustrating process of having to cancel your cards, and at the time waiting for 2 weeks to get your new card, and the realization that all of your data is across 100-odd locations, and we thought it was time for a fundamental shift. So really, my journey into self-sovereign digital identity was a personal one. Since then, have set up Nuggets. I'm the co-founder and COO of Nuggets, and we are a verified self-sovereign digital identity that provides trusted transactions. So yes, very excited to be here and listen to everyone's views and have this discussion.
Thanks so much, Seymour. Next, okay, I will come to Cornelius.
Good morning. I'm really excited to join my fellow panelists and talk about such an interesting topic. Particularly, as Louise mentioned, things are moving in hyperspeed, and so we need to be ready to move along with building confidence at the same rate. I am Cornelius. I am a program manager here at ID 2020. Over the past few years, I have been leading our efforts to support the implementation of good digital ID programs. Our aim for these projects is to have a meaningful immediate impact on the participants, to safeguard their privacy and well-being, and also to contribute lessons for future initiatives. And before digital ID, my background was primarily in monitoring and evaluation of economic development, including digital development initiatives. I think as a result, all of our support programs have this focus on sharing and building learnings. And I also tend to take quite a critical eye to our projects. So if I sort of come across like that, that's sort of the reason for it. To provide a little bit of background for those of you who don't know us, ID 2020 is a public-private partnership with the goal of defining and then delivering good digital ID. We like to think of ourselves as being both principled but pragmatic, which I guess is tough in this day and age. And then realizing our version or vision of good digital ID requires the right technology, the right regulations and governance, and the right implementation. As mentioned, my role primarily concerns this last component, the implementation part, and how do we successfully translate our principles and chosen technologies into tangible benefits for individuals. We see I probably will focus on this translation of education and confidence building in the field in my responses. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Cornelius. And it would be remiss of me to not to say thank you for joining us so early in your day. So I think we've got pretty much the full spectrum of very early morning, middle of the day for the UK, and evening in Singapore. So we've got every time zone pretty much covered today. And then last but by no means least, I will go to Hannah for an introduction.
Thank you, Louise. Hello, I'm Hannah Rutter, and I'm the Deputy Director in the Department for Digital, Culture, Media and Sport in the UK Government. And it is my privilege to lead up the Digital Identity Programme in DCMS with the aim of enabling digital identity products to be used right across the UK economy and to achieve international interoperability of those products. So yeah, obviously a topic which entirely relies on us securing trust. So for me, this is a really important topic and one that my team is consistently grappling with.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone. I think everyone will agree in the audience that we've got a really nice mix of public sector, private sector, and actually someone who sits at the intersection between the two. So hopefully we'll have a really good range of sort of rounded views that touch on all of the key segments within this discussion. So as a bit of a broad opener, as I love to do, and then we can drill down into some more detail, I'd be interested to get everyone's sort of just initial thoughts on the topic, on the title of this segment, which is, building public trust and confidence in the use of digital ID. So more of an opening remarks kind of section, and then we can delve into the detail. So if I come to you first, Kendrick, again, any sort of like opening summary remarks on this topic?
Sure. So I think in Singapore, we are fortunate, right, to actually have a foundational legal identity, right? And it's issued to all citizens at birth, right? And all residents, that means foreigners who work or live here, when their residency is approved, right? And this has actually allowed us to then issue a digital identity called SingPass based on this legal identity, right? And this has allowed us to do this to 97% of the eligible population, right? Facilitating 300 million transactions annually and supporting 1,700 different online services, right, with secure and trusted digital identities, right? So I think the continual maintenance of this trust and confidence is important, right? Because if we have the vision, right, that this is foundational to a digital economy, right, then we would like every citizen to be able to use it, like every business to be able to transact through it, right? And therefore, I think some of the things that have been quite important to us is to ensure that it's available to all residents who need it. The user experience is appropriate, for all demographics, whether you're very young, very old, savvy or not, right? The user's privacy is protected, and they have control over their data. The system is resilient and secure, right? And it's a platform with useful services from both the public and private sector, sufficient reach to the users, so that it's worthwhile for anyone to come on board, right? So I think these would be the topics, I hope to discuss and talk about in this session.
Absolutely, thank you. And I think as an interesting, not counterpoint, but maybe a different geographical perspective, it makes sense to go to Hannah next on this.
Yes, and as you say, Louise, this highlights one of the big things that we have across the globe for this, which is that the systems we have in place have to be specific and responsive to the cultures in which they're operating. So as Kendrick says, in Singapore, they have a sort of a universal identity system to start with, on which they can build their digital identity product. That isn't the case in the UK. We do not have ID cards or ID databases in that way. And often this has been seen as something that slowed us down compared to places like Singapore, but also different bits of the EU, which also have those sorts of identity systems that they've been able to build digital identities against. But for me, none of this works, as I mentioned, if you don't have public trust. And we know in the UK that there has been significant concern about the idea of government issued identity cards or gathering together sort of single identity databases. So therefore, what we've had to do in the UK is work out, okay, what can we do to hold on to the way that we do identity here, which is based on a slight sort of patchwork of information that we gather together often from public sector sources like passport data and driver's licenses, but also people often use banking information. You know, you're often asked to present utility bills, bank statements, those sorts of things to bring together to become sufficient proof of identity. And what we need to do in the UK is work out how we can use the sort of what is culturally seen as normal and acceptable in the way that we do it here into something that works digitally, because we know there's massive wins both in terms of the economy, productivity, enabling much more to happen online, but also those things about fraud protection, about making sure that people are in control of the information that they have. You know, you shouldn't have to have passports and bank statements photocopied and stored in estate agents' filing cabinets across the country. You know, there's got to be a better way. So for us, it's really important that we respond to what makes sense in the UK, make a system that works, but make sure that we are establishing trust, not only with the UK population, but internationally. So I know that I'm sure Kendrick and I'll come onto it, but we've recently signed a memorandum of understanding with Singapore to try and understand a bit more how we can get to the point where we can recognise officially digital identity products made in different countries. And part of that has got to be, we've got to have clear enough standards in the UK, not only that the public will trust them, but also that our international partners will trust them. So it's a really interesting process to go through to make sure that we are responding to the domestic situation, responding to the domestic need, but also making sure that what we're doing is clear and understandable and trustworthy enough that anyone can look at it and go, yeah, that's robust, we can work with that.
Interesting. I think you make a really interesting stipulation there of, you know, oftentimes when we think about trust, we think about how making sure consumers trust or citizens trust, but there's a really good point of we also need to make sure that there's that trust in, you know, government organizations from one country to another or from one geography to another, because that trust is just, it's more than just the citizen trust, I suppose. But I try not to interject too much. Cornelius, I'll come to you next on your sort of opening thoughts.
Absolutely, and again, very interesting question. I think a very difficult challenge. You know, what we've seen over the past few years, particularly ID 2020, has suffered a little bit from a lot of misinformation about us. You know, how does talking about biometrics then be sort of interpreted as implantable chips, etc.? We're very excited in some ways that people are aware of their rights for privacy. People are aware of surveillance capabilities of technologies, of government technology, but also sort of private company technologies, and it's good for them to be aware. I think it's important, particularly as someone who sort of lives in this space, to take a step back and realize that if we assume comprehension is a step towards building trust, that most people don't deal with these technologies on a day-to-day basis. And when we talk about distributed ledgers or zero-knowledge proofs or biometrics or any of the host of all of these complex concepts and technologies, that it is alienating. And so the way I've been sort of viewing this challenge is, how do we sort of build the necessary comprehension or other mechanisms to enable trust, rather than sort of focusing on just getting to trust right away. And so in our experience, particularly in sort of launching programs, which is obviously my background, and so I'm going to focus on it. It's investing in education and awareness, and again, making these complex technologies, these complex concepts easily digestible, but still complete. And that's a very tough thing when you're trying to get informed consent. How do you explain a solution like the Nugget solution to the average person without either being too simplistic or overwhelming them with detailed complex, and ultimately they come away with knowing less than if you'd gone a simpler route. And we found that this education and awareness does take time, which sort of, I think, conflicts with the need to have digital ID systems up and running. And so how do we build trust when trying to provide education to the participants is always going to lag a little bit. The second thing sort of is around building out strong governance and robust regulation. Typically what we see is, and I know this is probably a future question, is around that individuals use trust in the providing organization as a proxy for trust in the solution. So they're not going to understand the solution necessarily 100%. Instead, they're saying, this organization, whether it's an NGO, whether it's a government, whether it's a UN agency, has been providing services to me. I trust them because of X, Y, and Z reasons, and therefore I'm going to at least temporarily trust this solution until I can learn more. And then I think the final thing is, particularly for the ID 2020 approach, sort of the user-managed approach to digital ID, it's about seeing this technology in their day-to-day lives. It's taking the concept that's pitched to them either in policies or in slide decks and giving them the QR code that they can sort of scan to go to a restaurant here, in Canada, or to get on a plane. And it's when they can start to see meaningful benefits and they can interact with the platform that they can begin to build confidence in it, because it's not such an alien concept. So I think those are sort of, in my experience with programs, the three core components of building trust is education and awareness, strong supporting factors to lead to at least trust by proxy, and then being able to use it in their daily lives so that they can understand it's a good thing for them.
Awesome, thank you. And that kind of leads really nicely into Seymour's view on the world.
Yeah, thank you for that. So look, I think we've started from a place of where we believe personal information should be owned and controlled by the individual, and that a fundamental shift essentially needs to happen from the way data was used and is used today and the way it will be used. And there's a massive issue around that trust, right? Trust in the system that supports our current daily lives, whether it's online, offline, has been massively eroded. Whenever our customers sign up, transact, or pay for anything online, they're open to privacy, fraud, and security issues. And so existing identity solutions, whether they're federated or device dependent, are really not working right now. And also, I think, given some of what Hannah just mentioned there as a UK, that reluctance or that surveillance, the worry of that means that I think that the only way we can really deliver a digital identity solution is one that is owned and controlled by the individual, a self-sovereign type of identity that is verified and that there is trust at both ends of a transaction. So each of us know who we're dealing with. And I think, this is it's been a tough time where, the onus actually is always on the individual to prove who they are. I mean, think about your bank calling you and asking you for, do we have an overdraft? Please confirm your overdraft. Please confirm if you have a mortgage with us. These are everyday frustrations that each one of us, wherever we live, actually have to go through. And I think it shouldn't be on the end user to have to prove who they are. We need to build products and services that fraud prevention, privacy, and security is inherent in those products and services. So when they transact, they can be sure that they know who they're dealing with. So that's really my view. And the other part of this, I suppose, is this is an incredibly exciting time for digital identity. We've been hard at it since 2016, working with really nascent technologies like blockchain and looking at standards and being part of these working groups. And what's an incredibly exciting time, I feel like it's a perfect storm. There's this, data security, massively critical state, fraud's on the rise, regulations are tougher, and lots are happening around digital identity standards with the trust framework, HMLR, but globally, and the great work that ID 2020 is doing as well. And I also think technology has caught up alongside consumer wants and needs, where they want to be authenticated by something more than what they remember around who they are. And they want that to be in a contactless way. So yeah, an incredibly exciting time right now and a really timely discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you. So many points in what all of you have raised that I'm definitely going to pick up on as we run through the questions that I've got, and I've probably come up with a few more as you've all been talking. But my first thing, I suppose, is how have we seen public attitudes towards digital identity change since the start of the pandemic? So as I said in the intro, it's kind of just, we're on hyperspeed when it comes to digital identity now. So I'd be interested to hear your perspectives, and perhaps I can come back to you, Kendrick, and start there of how you've seen public perceptions and attitudes change towards digital ID.
Yeah, so thanks for that. So I think as has been mentioned earlier, right, the adoption of digital identity in Singapore actually, at least, we said that the users are, almost 100% provisioned, right? But in terms of the businesses that have picked it up and used it, right, in the last 1 year has actually grown 5 times in Singapore, right? And that's really because digital provided a way for them to continue to sustain their livelihoods, right? And in short, it's a manifestation of COVID accelerating digitalization, right? As Hannah said just now, the Singapore's Minister for Communications and Information, Ms. Josephine Teo, was in London last week. She signed 3 MOUs, as Hannah said, with Secretary Doris of the DCMS. And of course, one of the areas we want to collaborate on is on digital identity, right? And she also spoke about this topic of public attitudes at the inaugural Future Tech Forum, right? And there she said that Singapore has been fortunate and unique in that the degree of trust in society and institutions is quite high, right? And in fact, the trust in institutions is higher ahead of NGOs and businesses and even the media, right? And it's increased in spite of the pandemic, right? And so our challenge really is maintaining that trust, right? Because once the trust is lost, it's very hard to regain, right? And so I think in terms of the digital identity solution that we have in Singapore, we take a holistic view to it, right? I think the technology is one element, right? And the technology is evolving, right? Attitudes are also evolving, right? But I think fundamentally the policy and the principles have to be right? And I think at the conference, Ms. Teo also said that we have one North Star, right? And that's the well-being of our citizens, right? So I think with that, maybe I can share a few examples, right? So in our digital identity system, we have a personal data platform called MyInfo, and its primary purpose, right, is to allow citizens to access their data across different government agencies and tell us once, right, which most governments in the world are aiming to do, right? So that they do not have to repeatedly provide the same information or submit the same documents as they transact with different government agencies, right? Our platform also allows the citizen to control, to share that information with private sector services such as for the opening of bank accounts, right? In Singapore, if you are a low-risk customer, you can open a bank account in minutes, right? You can receive your digital credit card on your phone immediately, and your physical one comes in the mail maybe a week later, right? And basically this data sharing requires consent, explicit consent of the user in real time, right? So these will be example of policy and that's enforced by technology, right, to ensure that, right? And another example would be in the use of facial biometrics. So we have the facial biometrics as a service which agencies and the businesses can use, right? And actually, the way I've implemented it is to ensure that we use data that the government already has, so we don't need to collect any additional information, right? The user's consent is sought before any selfies are taken. We delete these selfies after 30 days, right? And no personal information other than a confidence score is returned to the business, right? And we review each implementation. We ensure that the design is optimal, right? The user journey is optimal, so it doesn't come across as technology for its own sake, right? We ensure there's an alternative. So if you're not comfortable right? In spite of its convenience, there's another way that you can verify yourself, right? And we ensure that it's accurate, right? As a multiracial society, we want to ensure that there is no bias as far as the technology is concerned, and that everyone gets verified accurately, right? So I think the point I want to make is that ensuring trust and confidence is a ongoing effort, right? There's a technology element to it, right? But ultimately, the principles and the policies are equally important.
Thank you, Kendrick. And Cornelius, come to you to see if you have perspectives on the public attitudes and whether or not you've seen them change over the past couple of years.
So I think the pandemic has, at the very least, dramatically increased awareness of digital ID along various use cases. I think a lot of people didn't quite realize that they were using IDs in their daily lives and just how important it was to them. So how it affected sort of public confidence and trust in them, I think has obviously varied geographically. Within countries, there are different demographics. There is obviously, here in the US, we've seen a lot of opposition to it. I think similarly in the UK. But one thing I would like to highlight is that, and I think this is generally positive, is that people are aware of their rights of privacy. As sort of Seymour was alluding to, there was this, as the pandemic took off and people were talking about either vaccine passports or they were talking about track and trace, there was a mindfulness about not creating surveillance systems. Not that they weren't created, but people were sort of aware that this was an issue. And I think from an ID 2020 perspective, it's heartening to see that people are sort of aware of their rights and privacy. And I think as a result, you had big corporations and sort of a lot of other smaller players who've been in this industry for a long time had an opportunity to display technologies which, and they're not perfect, and we're not getting sort of the best of every world, but they're enabling service access, they're enabling governments to be able to perform services that they need to, individuals to get the services they need to, while giving control of the data over to individuals. And I think there is a general awareness of this approach, which is fantastic. And so I think public confidence and trust, while still low because of previous violations, whether it's Facebook, whether it's a government, have eroded this trust over years. I think what we're seeing is an awareness of a different approach, and therefore a way to move towards that approach.
Yeah, I think totally agree. I think that makes sense. As a totally trivial example, I've been working in the digital ID space for quite some time, and I think it's only now that my mum has any idea of what it is I do for a living. So that's some new knowledge that we've gained over the pandemic. There's been some questions coming in, and one of them is particularly related to what Kendrick's just said, so I will add that in now. Someone has asked that, we've seen the announcement of the digital ID agreement with Singapore. When will we be able to see details of this? Not sure if that's something, Kendrick, you can comment on, or maybe Hannah, you can comment on, but do we have any thoughts on that? Or any timelines, perhaps, on when we might be able to see details of the agreement?
So we're hoping to start work on this memorandum of understanding next year, so that we can use our relationship with Singapore to really test the trust framework that we've been working on so closely with partners right across the UK, is to start testing how robust it is when we put it in front of international partners. So that's something we'll be working on next year.
Okay, wonderful. So it's a watch this space, but I'm sure we'll get plenty of updates as and when progress is made. Okay, so Seymour, if I come to you next, Cornelius, you've perfectly teed me up for this next question around how digital identity can actually benefit and empower the individuals. So we've talked about, the consciousness has been raised and the awareness is now starting to be there. There's lots of education to do. I appreciate that. But how can digital ID actually benefit and actually empower individuals?
Yeah, that was for me, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was for you, Seymour.
Okay, fantastic. No, good. So yes, this is the thing. One of the themes that we've seen throughout the pandemic is the need for security as well, and doing things in a really secure private manner rather than writing things on a piece of paper as you walk into a pub to say, you know, I mean, it's been bonkers how we've gone back on that side. So from our perspective, I mean, digital identity or a verified digital identity is the only real way that an individual can own and control their own data and be able to transact with a service that's better than a username and password that they have today. So from that empowerment perspective, I mean, there's been some brilliant things that have already been discussed now where end users or consumers know what their rights to privacy are. I mean, we've done an okay job with GDPR, but, you know, we're not doing such a great job with all those cookies that are coming up every time. We're giving away so much more data than we ever did before. We're all more connected than we all were before. We've got more connected devices. So as we are more mobile and more connected, we have to get this layer of digital identity with privacy and security, that trust layer, essentially really right. And this is why these standards are so incredibly important. So I think we're getting there though. When we first started testing our product in 2017 with the UK regulator in the sandbox, no one understood the concept of what does an identity even really mean? You know, is it my one-stop shop so I can now log in and pay for things? There took a lot of education. And even if you were to stop someone pre-pandemic on the street and say, you know, how would you feel if you had this one digital identity that you could transact with multiple services and just not leave all your data behind to be compromised, and there was a level of consent? They probably still wouldn't have really seen the benefit of that. Whereas now, COVID really has accelerated essentially innovations. You know, we are, because I mentioned earlier, we're doing those things more remotely, more contactless. Lots of us have been forced to work from home, connecting into services. I think it's become really clear the need in our everyday lives that we need to make sure that when we authenticate, it really does need to be us. And just like I mentioned earlier, just the being at home and receiving the scam calls, you know, the thing is, it's just really highlighted to everyone. You know, you just don't need to be from big tech or be working for a tech company or an identity company anymore to understand or realize the importance of an identity. And I think for the first time, the only way you can really get that is via a digital identity and not by a federated identity that is, you know, not interoperable. So I think we need to make these things, I think we all understand the concepts, but we need to make them incredibly useful for the end user so they don't end up having like 4 digital identities. They have one that is interoperable, and that's what makes these standards, whether they're W3C verifiable credentials or it's the trust framework, incredibly important to be able to execute solutions that make sense.
Okay. Yeah, totally agree. I mean, if you look at the number of different logins and passwords we have as it stands today, I'm one of those people. I don't remember any of my passwords. I rely on Apple to do that for me. If we could just have one, you know, fantastic. But you mentioned self-sovereign identity previously, Seymour. So I just wanted to pick back up on that and what role you think that plays in again empowering the individual, giving the power back to the individual.
Yeah, I think it plays a huge role, and if not the most important role if you get it right. So I think the problem has been lots of identity solutions don't work for particular participants. You know, they don't work. Some of them don't work for the business. Some SSI has not previously worked for business because they want to hold on to some of that data. They haven't worked for the consumer because maybe they're device dependent and you can only store it on your mobile. Hasn't worked for the compliance teams until now. So actually SSI done right, a verified self-sovereign identity that provides, whether it is auditable pieces of information that don't mean that an organization has to hold on to unnecessary amounts of your PII data, mean finally as an individual I can transact with businesses or regulated services, but without having to leave all my data behind in their honeypot silos. So I think SSI, really, it comes from, you know, self-sovereign identity is that I own and control my own identity, but it wouldn't be much use if you can't transact or consent with services and products and services that you love to use. You know, whether it is that you want to buy a new pair of shoes, but you don't really need to have all of my information saved on your merchant site for me to buy a pair of shoes, but what would be good is that you know that I like to buy socks every Thursday, so that you can personalize my experience. Or self-sovereign identity comes to life, where imagine, we were all ordering lots of things over the pandemic, me a bottle of gin, and the delivery driver said to me, Seymour, can you stand there, probably didn't know my name, with my ID whilst you took a picture of me, and that was the age verification. That's just bonkers. So wouldn't it be brilliant if you could just have, whether it was contactless delivery, you would be able to authenticate, yes, you have delivered it to me, and then you've got that trust. So we need to make these products and services have a meaningful role in the end user or the consumer's life. And I think that will be the key.
Fantastic. Okay, we've just had another question come in, which is linked to that actually, and it's around what is the role of governments vis-a-vis trustworthy interoperability? So I will have to point that at Hannah and Kendrick, I believe, as the government representatives today.
I'll attempt to answer that one. And just to, I think some of what Seymour was saying there is so important, in that you don't, I mean, I do, because I'm a sad and tragic human being, but most people don't wake up in the morning getting excited about digital identity. You don't wake up and think, oh, you know what I really want to do today? I really want to get myself a digital identity. What you do is go, what I really want to do is this. So, Seymour was talking about buying shoes. The example that I found that has really worked when I've been trying to get colleagues in policy around government to really get in there, it was about house buying and selling, because the desperate attempt to make that contactless during the pandemic, the need for that to be really robust and trustworthy on the identity side, but the insanity that people were seeing, that they were having to bring all their paperwork physically into offices, they were having to get things countersigned. It didn't feel secure, it didn't feel COVID safe. You were doing it, at least 4 times, if not more, you were having to verify your identity through one transaction. And being able to explain to people what we're talking about here, that, all this stuff that I'm doing with the trust framework, all the efforts we're making to make sure that these standards are clear and that everyone can recognize what good looks like, and businesses can say it needs to be, I need to know it's this good, and if you can prove it's this good, then I can trust it. Then I can explain to people that you could prove your identity once with one product and then just use it all the way through that process. It would save you money, time, so much more convenient, certainly more COVID safe. And it's that does the light bulb stuff for people. It's that makes people go, yes, I want this. Whereas if you ask people, do you want to, store an identity product on your phone, or do you want to, do whichever technology you use, people are a bit, why would I do that? Sounds a bit scary. But if you say how it will help their lives, how it will actually help them do something practical and meaningful, then that's when you get confidence and the desire to use it. But again, because as Seymour and others have raised the issues about fraud, about protecting people, governments need to make sure that as these products come onto the market, they are good and they do protect people, that they are sufficiently trustworthy, particularly trustworthy so regulated industries can say, yes, that's good enough for my know your customer or anti-money laundering requirements. So governments have to be part of making sure the standards are good and clear and can therefore be recognized by different regulators and different industries. And we have to make sure that the privacy and the user-centeredness is baked in from the start, so that these products come out and are beneficial to people and deliver these benefits that we think there are. The fraud, the data minimization, the ease of use, all of those things are really important. But if we don't bake them into the standards, we might not achieve them. So that's why they have to be there. And the other thing we as government really need to focus on is inclusion. So we have to make sure that it is possible for anyone who wants to have a digital identity product to have one, that this isn't something that just makes life easier for those with, a high-end smartphone and a chip-readable passport. It's great that the tech can respond to those things, but we need to have options that work for everybody. And therefore, we need to make sure we're thinking about inclusion from this sort of the standards point of view, and right through the sort of the stack of what we need to be doing to enable digital identity use, so that we don't end up with the sort of the digital divide getting bigger because of the use of this technology. I want this to be a technology that use of digital identity products actually helps people who traditionally struggle to prove identity to be able to do things. And I think industry and government working together, we really can achieve that. So for me, that's a really important part of it.
Absolutely. Kendrick, I think there was something that you wanted to add.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. Yeah, so actually, recently we launched our digital identity card, right? So basically it's a version that appears on the app, right? And there was a huge debate, or rather there was certain groups who felt very strongly that they didn't want it to appear on the app, right? And there was another very large group who thought that it was wonderful that they now don't have to bring their wallets out. They can just go out with a smartphone, but maybe with also a power bank, right? So I think this highlighted to us actually that users are becoming more aware and more conscious about the privacy and the rights that they have, right? And this is on top of the fact that we have the Personal Data Protection Act, right? So some of these users actually they want to verify themselves while minimizing the amount of data that's shared. They do not want the IT system to keep a trail of the transaction. Very similar to what Seymour had mentioned, right? But this can be feasible, for certain transactions, right? So perhaps buying a bottle of gin. You're old enough to buy a bottle of gin, but it may not be enough perhaps for KYC, financial services, right? But these are trends that all, I think, digital ID systems will need to address, right? And I think there are a range of technology options. And I think in Singapore, what we have had to do for COVID vaccine certification, right, is that we've actually issued health certs, which is based on an open attestation framework, which is actually implemented using either Ethereum smart contract or DID, right? And basically what we had to do was to be able to attest this against the national digital identity, right? So that you can bind, that you are indeed a real person and you're the guy or girl who actually got vaccinated, right? And I think this is a nexus, right? Where, as Seymour said, it has to, in the end, create a benefit. In the end, it has to be something that's useful, and I think COVID certificates are, very contemporary, right? So we're able to store this in the SingPass app, which is the touch point for all citizens. And I think we're very happy that it's now EU DCC compatible and being used for the VTLs, since the 7th of December, right? So I think, it's really about looking for the use cases, finding the right technology. So for example, to us, W3C verified claims is going to be quite important in this area. It uses many of the same digital ledger technologies that SSI is based on, right? And I think such implementations can be expanded to other use cases, right, to really maximize user privacy in digital transactions.
Thank you. Okay, last question for me, because I realized the time has just completely disappeared. And then I will try and tackle some of the other questions that have come in, but it's on the point of inclusion, which Hannah, you raised perfectly. There is the potential that, as we drive towards digital IDs and leveraging smartphones and things like passports and driver's license, that we could broaden that divide, because there's, a massive swathe of populations in whichever country that you think about that don't have access to those documents or to that technology. So I want to pick up specifically on the trust framework here in the UK, and come to you, Hannah, on how you're tackling that from a DCMS perspective and an inclusion perspective.
Great, thank you, Louise. Yes, this is one of the things I like to get on my soapbox about. So
me too.
Delighted to have a question. As I hinted at in my last answer, we won't have succeeded if we don't bake in inclusion from the start. And part of that is working with industry, and we're talking about helping those who get certified against the trust framework. We want them to be able to share information with the governance function for digital identity, so that we can understand what the market's doing and spot where gaps might be. So there's sort of a role for government and for governance in making sure that we are really carefully watching what the market is doing, and are there people being excluded, and therefore what action do we need to take to prevent that happening. But for me, it goes also beyond the trust framework, the responsibility of government in this piece, which is to make sure that it isn't just passports and driver's licenses that these things can be built upon. So we published our consultation document back in the autumn. And we're hoping to get a response out shortly, where we talked about opening up a new legal gateway to enable checks in the same way that you currently can against passport data, to enable checks against other sorts of data that government has on you, so that you can say, well, if I've already proved it to DWP, why can't I then give permission for that proof to be used in the private sector in some way? So, but at the moment there isn't a legal route for that sort of checking to take place. For that to work, again, the public trust has to be really carefully done. So we have to make sure that only trustworthy sort of organisations can do those sorts of checks, and that data is definitely in the hands of the people it talks about in the way that those checks are made. So we have to be really careful. But I'm always struck by the example of prison leavers. So, you come out of prison and then it's really hard to have the sort of documentation that people trust that will enable you to open a bank account, get a job, get a house, rent a flat. Which seems a bit mad, because we in the government know, you've been serving at Her Majesty's pleasure. We know who you are. Why can't the individual leaving prison use that trust that exists in the state system to be able to then do things they need to do out in the private sector? So for me, there's the sort of the standards thing that we really need to do. There's then the collaborative working, government with industry, with civil society, to test things and get the use cases up and make sure we're continuing to hold a spotlight. And then there's making sure that identities can be built on a broader range of trusted data sets, so that we're not excluding people who, for example, don't have a passport.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, I promised I would stop myself asking further questions and come to the ones that have been submitted. So the next one that I can see is, interestingly, we've talked a little bit about a single source of truth or a single digital identity, and someone has raised the question, what evidence is there that people want to be reliant on a single identity anymore than they are on a single bank account or credit card? So I don't know who wants to tackle that one. Seymour, you're nodding, so I'm going to come to you.
I think the one thing we do know is that we don't want multiple accounts. So we know already there's lots of research that's been done that most of us have over 100 online accounts where we have potentially shared credentials across all of those things, and they are being breached. So what we do know is that it needs to be not that. I think right now, by saying there'll just be a single identity would be tough, because obviously, although that interoperability exists, you could have more than one. But again, you would have the benefit because of the interoperability standards being in place. So even if you did have 3 identities, whether it was one powered by your bank account and it was one powered by, maybe you had a personal one, but they should be interoperable, essentially. I think that's the point that we're making. You shouldn't have to have multiple environments in which you're setting up these sorts of credentials and leaving them behind. So that would be my point of view on it. Whatever, essentially, what we have right now is an unworkable solution. And for us, one might feel like it's utopian, but I think there might be a middle ground. But I think that interoperability and standards piece is key to that. I don't know if that goes to some way to answering that question. I don't know if anyone else has any views.
I mean, I think it does. I don't know who posted it, and perhaps they can share more in the chat or reach out to one of us afterwards if we haven't answered it sufficiently. If no one else has any other views, then I will take the final question that I can see is, who's getting this right? Have we got examples of where this is sort of public trust is being instilled successfully, and we're just getting it right? So I don't know if anyone wants to share that. Maybe I can come to you, Cornelius, if you've got a view on any examples where you think this is going particularly well, or others, whoever wants to jump in.
It's a good question, and it's one I frequently get asked, and it's one I frequently struggle with, because ID 2020 sets quite I'll say a high standard for digital ID, and so it's difficult to point to real world examples where we think they're getting everything right. I mean, sort of take the EU COVID certificate. I think they're doing a lot of good thing. Public trust is reasonably high. We don't like that there isn't selective disclosure, but it's moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there are a lot of examples where people are moving in the right direction, both sort of the technological approach and public trust corresponding. But I'm not sure getting it right, I think, is probably a step too far. But I think the EU is a great example as well.
Okay, so we're going for progression over perfection in this instance. I think is probably the best, and I'm fairly sure that's a line I stole from a fitness instructor. But anyway, okay. Does anyone have? Because I'm conscious that we are getting up to time, and I don't want to delay people from lunch because I hate being that person. So any final thoughts from anyone that they want to share? If not, then we can close out. So Kendrick, any final thoughts from you? I know you're conscious to get back into your evening, so I'll come to you first.
Yeah, so I just want to touch on the memorandum of understanding that we signed with the UK. I mean, there were three, but the one on digital identity excites me the most because, I think that means Hannah and I will probably be working somewhat closely on that, right? And I think what we're trying to do, right, really is to, digital identity, that's not interoperable. It's like monopoly money, right? You can use it in the game, you can't use it outside. COVID has shown that, it's important because, travel is just one interoperability, but there is so much more potential, economic potential especially, right? In terms of trade, digital services, and the economies of all our countries, right? If we can get this right? So I think there's going to be a lot of work around understanding the frameworks of our countries, right? What's the equivalent? Doesn't have to be exactly the same, but you need to understand where that is, right? I think it helps that we have used open standards like OIDC, OAuth2, GWKS, and so forth, right? So I think that will be one less hurdle, right? But then I think the use cases, the policies will be important because we're going to bring across the benefits. And I think the outcome we hope to have, right, is really one where, for us, a SingPass user, we'll be able to use the Reliant service, say, of GovUK Verify or OneID, or the equivalent, and vice versa, right? So that residents in Singapore, which is the UK, we can transact online digitally before we even reach each other's countries, right? And as digital identity becomes used also in face-to-face transactions, that we can live like a local, right, in each other's countries. Right? So really looking forward to this work on the MOU.
Fantastic, thank you. And a great soundbite there, live like a local. I'm stealing that one as a hashtag. Seymour, any closing thoughts from you?
I think I may have mentioned this throughout, but it'd be good to finish on it. I think from our perspective or from the industry, that whole role of trusted transactions key, and it's trusted transactions at both ends of a transaction. So never like before has there been consensus that digital identity used to be a trend, but can now actually is a real life thing that can deliver on that. So incredibly excited about that. But just to end with, really, from my perspective, I'm so excited about what's happening and all of these things coming into play all at the same time, like those technological advancements, governments, regulation, consumer sentiment, and in every good technological launch or revolution, all of those things need to come together. And because this will take a revolution of, we managed data this way yesterday and we're going to manage it in a very different way going forward, it's almost needed this tipping point, and I feel like finally we're there. So I'm excited.
Wonderful, you're right, perfect storm of everything coming together at the same time. Cornelius, final words.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think to sort of echo a lot of the fellow panelists that there's an sort of exciting storm. We launched our Good Health Pass Collaborative, and we had sort of 200 plus organizations sign up, many of which really haven't interacted in the space before, but they're sort of recognizing that this technology, this approach is critical for them to deliver benefits for for their customers, for their citizens, for for whoever they serve. I would harken back to sort of the 3 points I think I opened with, which is trying to build awareness among the population. And I'll not to sort of criticize my panels, but things like self-sovereign identity, I think means we're all familiar with the term. We've all heard it multiple times. I'm not sure the average person off the street would understand what that means. How do we distinguish credentials versus ID? And I think a lot of people take your credential to be your ID. And so I think we do need to have a common, consistent language with how we communicate with the public, not only to sort of build trust and confidence in our approaches, but also because that's a core part of our approach, informed consent. And then I think finally around sort of trust in institutions, particularly when we look at things like selective disclosure and even informed consent, what we typically see is people trust organizations and they don't really read the fine print. So when we talk about sort of trustless societies in some contexts, I'm not sure that's desirable or feasible. And so, it is necessary to have the right policies, regulations, and other protections in place so that people can feel comfortable with making a decision. So I think those, and then finally, I think to Hannah's point around, people seeing this work for them. They can access a service, they can do something they need to do. They're not just using an ID for the sake of using an ID.
Brilliant, thank you. And then final word from Hannah. Any final thoughts?
I'll try and be really quick. I think building on the question that Cornelia struggled with is anywhere getting it right, and that's why here in the UK we are taking a kind of a step test. Does it work? Keeping it as sort of to borrow from my tech colleagues, all these sort of agile language. But when you're doing something that does feel very new, that does feel like we're having to learn on the go because technology and public perceptions and what is possible is changing all the time. There is no way that I or my team are going to be able to come out with the perfect system and then that will continue to be perfect for the next 3, 5, 10 years. So I think it's a sort of a plea for people to come with us as we go through this learning process. We're going to do everything we can to get it right. But we are going to have to take an iterative process. We are going to have to kind of try it in different areas and see what works so that we can keep it moving along with innovation, along with public expectation and public trust. So I just would ask your whole audience to continue to do what many have already been doing, which is really engaging with us as we test and learn. We've got more to do over the coming year. So eager to have people on board for that journey.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everyone. It's been, honestly, we could keep this panel going for at least another hour, but I'm conscious that people need to get some lunch ahead of the plenary session, which is at 12:30. So the platform will remain live until then, but please, everybody go refresh, get some lunch, and then navigate back to the main session where you can join the plenary at 12:30. Thank you to all of these brilliant panelists. I'm sure we'll be continuing this conversation on Twitter and other social media channels. And that's everything from us. Thank you so much.